A question we'd love to have the answer to is how Shylock was represented on stage in the original production of the play in the late 1590s by Shakespeare's acting company. Details of the specifics of Shakespearean staging are tantalisingly sparse. But one thing we know is that the character of Barabbas the Jew in Christopher Marlowe's highly popular play, The Jew of Malta, had a long nose. There's a reference in a poem of the time to a bottle nose like that of the Jew of Malta. So many scholars have suggested that Shylock would also have been played with a large prosthetic nose, an archetypal piece of racist stereotyping, the Jewish nose. Now, it's certainly the case that in later ages, in the 18th century, well over 100 years after Shakespeare's death, the Jew Shylock was portrayed thus. We know, for example, that in the 1740s, a very much admired actor called Charles Macklin played the Jew in a very stereotypical way, as a quasi-demonic figure. But we don't know for sure that that was how it was played in Shakespeare's time. There's that very puzzling line at the beginning of the trial scene, the great pound of flesh scene, where Portia, disguised as the young lawyer who's going to come and sort out the dispute about the bond, the pound of flesh, she comes to the courtroom and a question is asked: which is the merchant here and which the Jew? Which is the merchant and which the Jew? The line, a typical symmetrical Shakespearean line balancing the two halves, the two images, suggests that visually the merchant and the Jew are not readily distinguishable. If Shylock had been wearing the stereotypical bottle nose and red wig that Barabbas, the Jew, had in Marlowe's play, surely it would have been obvious which was the merchant and which the Jew. So it's an open question, an unresolved question, as to how Shylock looked visually on the original Shakespearean stage. But there is no doubt that in the subsequent stage history of the play, for about 200 years, he was represented as the stereotypical Jew. However, in 1879, the great Victorian actor Henry Irving played Shylock in what seems to have been a new way. Irving did a lot of historical research, and he dressed Shylock as a Jew in historical terms and treated with a kind of respect. There was nothing here of the old red wig and bottle nose, nothing of the caricature. Rather, Irving attempted to represent Shylock as a real Jew, as a human being. And I've got here in front of me an engraving which says, "From a photograph by Locke and Whitfield of Regent Street of Mr. Henry Irving as Shylock." We're in the early age of photography now, so for the first time, actors can be recorded as they really were, rather than interpreted through painting and engraving. And clearly, Irving's Shylock is a figure of enormous humanity, enormous sympathy. It's perhaps worth remembering that at this point in the mid-Victorian era, probably the best known image of a Jew would have been the horrific figure of Fagin in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. His long beard, his hooked nose. These are things that Irving is trying to resist in the representation of Shylock. Irving has picked up on the great speech about our common humanity and is producing a version of Shylock for the theatre that is much more sympathetic. It was genuinely a transformational moment in the history of the staging of the play. Another transformational moment obviously came with the rise of Nazism. After the Holocaust, it's very difficult to avoid a troubled focus on the centrality of the Jewish question within the play. It's intriguing, though, that shortly before news came to England of the rise of the Nazis and their persecution of the Jews, scholars in the 1920s were beginning to wonder whether actually the most important thing about Shylock was not his Jewishness, but the fact that he was, to use that word of Sand's in his travels to the Holy Land, that he was an alien, an outsider, a stranger. Jews weren't the only traders, moneylenders, immigrants in Venice, just as Murano Jews weren't the only outsiders or aliens in Shakespeare's London. Huguenot exiles from the religious civil wars, Lombards, people from Lombardy in northern Italy, again in exile from war. They too were traders, exchangers, moneylenders. And in the 1920s, as I say, people began to say, maybe Shylock's Jewishness is not so important after all. Maybe what's important is the idea of the role of the outsider, the alien, within an exchange mechanism, a society based on trade. It's difficult to sustain that position now because of what we know of the full history of the persecution of the Jews. But in thinking about the Merchant of Venice, we shouldn't allow ourselves solely to focus on the question of race, because surely at the centre of this play is the question of money. After all, the play, when it was published, was not called The Jew of Venice, in the way that Marlowe called his play The Jew of Malta. It was called The Merchant of Venice, and it was written by William Shakespeare, the Merchant of Stratford.